Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is May 2nd, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about what is OPEC anyway, and why it still affects your life every day. Yeah, this one matters because a lot of people hear OPEC and assume there's a single group somewhere controlling oil prices and, by extension, controlling their life at the pump. But that's not exactly what's happening. Now, to understand what OPEC is, you have to go back to a time when oil-producing countries didn't control their own oil at all. Western companies set the prices, controlled production, and took the bulk of the profit. OPEC was formed as a response to that. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela coming together to say, we're going to decide what our oil is worth. Now, for a short window in the 1970s, that worked. OPEC reduced supply, prices surged, and the world felt it immediately. That moment created the image people still carry today, that OPEC runs the oil market, but that control didn't last. The countries inside OPEC don't all want the same thing. Some need higher prices, others need to sell more volume. At the same time, other nations outside OPEC started producing more oil, and financial markets began influencing prices just as much as physical supply. Well, the system got bigger than OPEC. So what you're looking at today isn't a controlling force. It's a group trying to manage something that no single group fully controls anymore. Saudi Arabia is the best example of this. It still has enormous influence because it can change production quickly. But even if it doesn't operate in a vacuum, it works with OPEC when it makes sense, moves outside of it when it doesn't, and balances relationships across multiple global powers. That's why it can feel like the rules keep changing, well, because they are. And this is where it hits home. Oil isn't just gas. It's transportation, food, shipping, manufacturing, clothing, everything that comes and gets built. Everything that moves and gets built. And when oil prices shift, your cost of living shifts with it. And because the system is now driven by multiple competing forces, countries, markets, demand, conflict, well, it reacts fast as often unpredictability. And what feels like chaos is really a system under constant pressure, adjusting in real time. Well, once that clicks, the confusion starts to fade because you realize it's not one group pulling the strings, it's a global system that no one fully owns anymore. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm looking forward to it. Shout out to everybody on the live chat rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion saying, hey, Pastor and Warrior family, it feels great to be back. That's funny. Number two warrior is Boots, the Sparkman Spleefer Hafner, the Powder Room King, stating, all right. Hello, James and Warrior family. Glad to see y'all here. And let's help out our host, Rumble, famous by smashing that thumbs up button. Savvy, mate? Yeah, so do me a favor. Follow my thumb if you could. Go down with me. Hit the X button on your phone, then hit thumbs up, and then hit live chat. You won't lose your spot, I promise. Also, Boots will probably remind you that you got to take your next edition of Elite Potion. Guys, this is the best product on the market. The best, because it has double the ingredients than any other competition. The reason why they don't have those ingredients is because they didn't put them in to save money and lower the cost. Well, they have to be in because I did my work. I did my research, and AI says that this is the best for the body for removing parasites and heavy metals. And you want to do them at the same time. The reason being is because heavy metals cut little tiny veins inside your stomach, and parasites can get through. And when parasites get through, they get into your bloodstream. They stop at places and start a colony. That's not what you want. You got to get rid of the parasites and heavy metals. That's how you do a proper United States of America detox. That's how I should have branded it. America, fuck yeah, get your detox on. Anyway. All right, guys, thank you so much. Let's get into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
That's what it is. Well, Germany responds and says U.S. troops withdraw as anticipated, as Spain and Italy could be next. Well, us removing our troops out we're basically telling Russia, do what you want. You want a piece of Germany? Go right ahead. Because we are not going to protect those assholes. That's pretty much what Trump is saying. And Spain and Italy, because when we asked them for help to, go into Iran and stop, what looked to be a monopoly being used by Britain for a very long time, well, Spain and Italy, since they're still aligned with the King Charles. Oh my God. Well, they said no, and now we're going to remove our troops from them too, and we'll tell Russia, hey, go get them, because we don't care. And to be honest, I'm shocked. Something happened in January where Trump did a complete 180, where he's now doing what I wanted him to do in the beginning. And he's going after what seems to be the controllers of the world. And I can't explain it, and I'm not going to say it was Q and the Anons, but I can tell you that something's going on, and the policies that he's doing is actually going to help America in a great way. When he took Venezuela, that changed the entire chessboard by removing China's power from getting oil from there. Now, China is forced to get it from Iran. There's no other place they can get oil except for Canada. But Canada can't produce the amounts that China needs. So China is basically being chokehold right now because Saudi Arabia is trying to give them oil on the side through OPEC, which we're going to learn tonight. And it's not enough for their production. They're not. It's not enough. So something happened. I don't know what. Now, I do know that the Bible shows us that leaders will be put in, and if the people repent, then those leaders will start doing things for the people. Well, did America repent? I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I personally am in Truman's world. You know, the Truman Show? Because I don't know what it is, but when I started to change my heart back in January, change my heart from just blindly sending you conspiracy theories without any proof, basically gossiping, and not holding myself accountable to real information and making a decision not to lie. Well, all of a sudden, I'm seeing the opposite of what I saw from last year with Trump. So I don't know how to explain that other than, did it just take one person to repent? One person to just do what's right according to God? And that's stop killing, stealing, destroying. Well, if I'm that guy, you're welcome. Trump says he'll review new plan from Iran as U.S. fast-tracks $8 billion in arms sales to someone else. $8 billion isn't that much money, so I don't know why that's a big deal. Supreme Court asked to restore access to abortion pill by mail. The Supreme Court were asked. Have they done it? We don't know. Trump says new strikes possible if Iran misbehaves. Well, I say just do it. You know, the Nike slogan. Get it out of the way. Insiders spill on untouchable Pentagon. Pete's crazed power grab. Ooh. Pete Hegseth, everyone's scared of him. Pete has become emboldened to do as he pleases with the Pentagon, according to the Daily Beast, as his willingness to do with President Donald Trump bidding has apparently shielded him from pushback. Apparently, insiders say. We don't have to have any proof that these insiders are real, but we can say that now because Smith-Mundt Act just didn't get, put back in. The defense secretary, 45 years old, is confident his job is safe after the firings of 3 other cabinet officials and is weaponizing his invincibility to consolidate power over the Defense Department. Officials told the Washington Post. Ooh. Well, it's all about oil. It's all about control. We went into Iran when Russia and China were the weakest, and they were. We blew the shit out of Iran a year ago. Russia, China did nothing. So they expected it. They knew it was coming, and they didn't do anything. So we'll see what happens. 1 person dead after vehicle crashes into an Oregon health club in my home state. Police say, according to ABC News, 1 person is dead following a fiery crash at a health club early Saturday in Portland, Oregon, according to authorities who also said explosive devices, some of which had detonated, were found. Police Chief Bob Day told reporters this appeared to be an isolated event. It occurred shortly before 3 a.m. at the witching hour at the Multnomah Athletic Club. I think that's in Hillsboro. The facility bills itself as the largest private athletic and social club in the U.S., founded in 1891, and it boasts 21,000 members. Police said the person who died was found inside the vehicle after the fire was contained, but details shared by police and federal law enforcement, were sparse. Jim Dufresne, police officer and supervisor of the Metro Explosive Disposal Unit, said propane tanks were among the items found. He said investigators believe the explosive material was brought in by the vehicle. Well, I'm sure it's what's all on your mind. Were they left? Were they right? Well, doesn't matter. People go crazy when they follow the news and start hating on the left and right. So let's stop the hate. Let's get back into common sense. What say you? All right, when we come back, we're going to be talking about OPEC. What is it? And why it still affects your life every single day. Yeah, it does.
We are being lied to about our sovereignty, about our health, about birth, and about what's actually best for our families. And most women don't even realize it until they're already in the system. Hi, my name is Lisa, the Sovereign Woman. I'm going live every single day for 31 days at 8 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday on YouTube and TikTok. This is for the woman who knows there has to be another way. A way to give birth without fear, without being controlled, without giving up her authority. Inside these lives, I'm teaching you how to surrender to God, trust your body, and step into a truly sovereign and fearless birth. Not from hype, not from rebellion, but from truth. So if you feel that pull, like something isn't right, like you were made for more than what you've been told, come join me. I'll see you live.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
All right, guys, we're back. What is OPEC? What is it? OPEC, O-P-E-C, and why it still affects your life every day. Well, welcome to Cause Before Symptom, where we don't chase the headline, we test what's behind it. Because right now, people are feeling it. You pull up to the pump and the price is different than it was last week. Groceries are higher, shipping costs ripple through everything, and somewhere in the background, you keep hearing the same word, OPEC. Like there's a single room somewhere, a single decision, a single group controlling the outcome. But if that were true, it wouldn't feel this unstable. So tonight, instead of reacting to the symptom, we're going to understand the system. Now, there was a time when oil was controlled very simply. Not by countries, not by companies. Western corporations decided how much oil came out of the ground, what it was worth, and who profited. Yeah, Western, Europe and America. Now, the nations sitting on that oil didn't set the price. They accepted it. And OPEC was born out of that imbalance. It wasn't created to dominate the world that we know of. It was created to stop being dominated. Countries came together and said, hey, we're going to control our own resources. And for a moment in history, that worked. Supply tightened, prices surged, and the world realized something had shifted. But here's what doesn't get talked about enough. That kind of control doesn't hold in a system this big, because every country inside that group has its own needs. Some need higher prices to survive. Others need to sell more oil to stay afloat. Some follow the plan, some break it. Like Russia when they got caught shipping Venezuela oil and switching flags on the tanker. And while that's happening, the rest of the world doesn't sit still. New oil sources come online. Technology changes the game. Markets begin pricing oil not just on monopoly or supply, but on expectation, speculation, and fear. What started as control turns into negotiation, and what looked like power turns into pressure. And today, that's where we are. Not in a world where one group controls oil, but in a world where many forces are pulling on it at the same time. Saudi Arabia still has influence, yes. It can move production faster than anyone. But even it operates inside a system it doesn't fully command. It adjusts. It balances. It responds. And that's why the prices you see don't move in a straight line. They react to demand, to conflict, to policy, to perception. So when it feels unpredictable, it's not because something hidden is controlling everything perfectly. It's because nothing is. It's a system under constant tension, constantly adjusting. And once you understand that, something shifts. The confusion fades, and you stop looking for a single cause and start seeing the pressure points. Because the truth is, oil isn't just about energy, it's about everything that moves. And when the system that moves everything is under pressure, you're going to feel it. So before OPEC ever existed, and guys, I found 50 books and more, and went through all of it. I'm pretty confident this is as true as I can get. And before OPEC ever existed, the oil system was already built. And it wasn't built by the countries that owned the oil. It was built by corporations. A small group of Western companies, often called the Seven Sisters. You ever heard of them? I didn't, not until I did this report. They controlled nearly every part of the process. They had the technology, the infrastructure, the shipping, the refining, and most importantly, the pricing power. They decided how much oil would be produced and what it would sell for. The countries were that the countries where that oil was found, places like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela, were part of the system, but they weren't in control of it. And what that meant in real terms is this: oil-producing nations were being paid based on decisions made somewhere else. Prices could be lowered when supply increased, and the producing countries had very little say in that. Their economies depended on oil revenue, but they didn't control the lever that determined how much that revenue would be. And over time, that imbalance started to become obvious. The more oil was discovered, the more production increased, and the more the price could be pushed down. So even as demand grew globally, the countries supplying the oil weren't necessarily benefiting from it. Now, at the same time, something else was happening in the background. These regions were going through political change with the help of probably some secret services. These regions, independent and in movements, were rising. And with that came a shift in thinking. Nations began to look at their natural resources as not as something to be managed by foreign companies, but as something tied directly to their own sovereignty. Oil wasn't just a commodity anymore, it was leverage. It was the foundation of national income, development, and long-term stability. And once that realization set in, the existing system started to feel less like a partnership and more like a constraint. So the stage was set before OPEC was ever formed. You had a global system where control and ownership were separated. The resource belonged to one group, but the decision-making power belonged to another. And as long as that imbalance existed, something was going to push back against it. Now, OPEC didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the result of that pressure building over time, the Seven Sisters and their control. Until the countries involved decided they were going to take that control back. So what started as frustration didn't stay quiet. It turned into conversations, and those conversations turned into coordination. The countries dealing with this imbalance, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, they were all facing the same pressure. They owned the oil, but they didn't control what it was worth. And once they started talking to each other, well, that realization sharpened. This wasn't one country being treated unfairly. This was the structure itself. Now, Venezuela is a big part of this story, and it doesn't get enough attention. They had already been pushing back against the system, arguing that oil shouldn't be treated like just another commodity. It's finite. Once it's gone, it's gone. So pricing it cheaply, letting outside companies dictate its value, didn't make sense long term. That thinking started spreading. And when it connected with Saudi Arabia sitting on a massive reserve, you had something forming that wasn't there before. Not power just yet, but an alignment. So when that meeting happened in Baghdad in 1960, it didn't look like much on the surface. It wasn't headline news. It wasn't treated like a major turning point. But what was happening is in that room was simple and significant at the same time. These countries were saying, instead of acting alone, we're going to act together. And that changes everything, because oil pricing isn't just about demand, it's about balance. Too much supply, prices drop. Too little, prices rise. And before this, that balance was controlled by companies. Now the producers were stepping into that role. But agreeing to work together and actually doing it are two very different things. Every country at that table had its own situation. Now, some needed money immediately and wanted higher prices fast. Others had enough reserves to think long term and preferred stability. Some were under political pressure. Others were dealing with internal development needs. So even as they came together, there was tension underneath it. Alignment on the outside, but different priorities underneath. And that tension never really went away. It was there from the beginning. What OPEC created wasn't a command center. It was a place where competing interests tried to move in the same direction long enough to have an effect. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes it didn't. But the idea itself mattered. For the first time, oil-producing nations had a mechanism to push back together instead of individually, to push back against the West. And the West was Europe and America. Well, the early years didn't flip the system overnight. The companies still had contracts with the West. They still controlled infrastructure. They still had influence. But something had shifted. Governments started taking more ownership of their oil industries. National oil companies began to form, meaning in Venezuela, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran. Contracts started getting renegotiated, and slowly the balance began to move. Oh, too bad for the Seven Sisters. And that's the part people don't usually see. It wasn't one dramatic moment where control changed hands. It was gradual. Pressure building, adjustments being made, influence shifting piece by piece. And by the time the world really noticed that in the 1970s, the groundwork had already been laid. You guys remember that? That we ran out of oil in the 70s? Well, that crisis was because the Seven Sisters were getting their way. Well, once these countries realized they could influence supply together, the system stopped being fixed. It became something that could be moved. And once that happens, everything downstream starts to react. Now, by the time this coordination started to take shape, something important needed to be understood clearly. What this group actually was and what it wasn't. Because this is where most of the confusion still comes from today. People hear OPEC and imagine a centralized authority, like a control room where decisions get made and the rest of the world just reacts. Well, that could have been when the Seven Sisters were doing it. But that's not how it works. That's not OPEC. What you really have is a group of independent countries sitting at the same table, trying to move in the same direction without giving up their own interests. Now, there's no global switch that they flip. There's no enforcement mechanism that forces every member to comply. Every country still controls its own oil, its own production levels, its own budget, its own survival. So when they agree on something like reducing production, it only works if each member actually follows through. And that's where the tension starts to show. Okay, you can have Venezuela, who is socialist, and the people aren't making much money, but the people want money, and the country needs money. And you got Iran or Saudi Arabia, and they're producing plenty, and they've got the infrastructure to just sell it on the cheap and sell it in bulk. And Venezuela's like, this doesn't work for me. We need to sell at a higher price. We can't produce in bulk. Does that make sense? That's tension between OPEC. Because think about it in real terms. If you're a country that depends heavily on oil revenue and prices are low, you need income. Cutting production might raise prices in theory, but it also means selling less oil right now. Well, that's a trade-off. Some countries can afford to wait for higher prices. Others simply can't. So even when there's an agreement, the pressure to produce more is always sitting underneath it. And that's why you hear about quotas, limits set for how much each country is supposed to produce. And it's also why those quotas don't always hold. So what OPEC becomes is less of a controller and more of a negotiation space. It's where these countries come together, try to read the market, and decide what move gives them the best outcome collectively, together, knowing full well that each member is still making its own decisions behind the scenes. Well, sometimes they align, sometimes they don't. But that dynamic never disappears. And then there's the outside pressure. Politics, secret services from the Seven Sisters countries. Well, because while OPEC is trying to coordinate internally, the rest of the world is watching and reacting. Oil-consuming countries don't just sit back and accept higher prices. They look for alternatives. They invest in new production. They change policies. Companies adapt. Markets respond. So even if OPEC agrees to cut supply as an agreement together, the rest of the system starts adjusting to counter that move. And that's what makes this very different from the true cartel. A true cartel would require tight discipline and control over the majority of supply. But here, you've got internal competition inside the group and external competition outside of it. So every decision that OPEC makes is being pulled in two directions at the same time, by its own members and by the global market reacting to it. And that's where Saudi Arabia starts to stand out. Not because it owns OPEC, but because it has something the others don't: flexibility. Saudi Arabia can increase or decrease production faster and at a larger scale than most of the other members. That gives it a different kind of influence. For example, if Saudi Arabia is doing great and the production they're doing is great, and they're happy with the agreements and the contracts and all of the things just working very wonderfully, and then Venezuela comes in and says, you have got to raise the prices. We're hurting over here. You're killing us, Smalls. Well, it's not acting in isolation. It's reading the same pressures, dealing with the same trade-offs, just with more room to maneuver. So when you step back and look at it clearly, OPEC isn't a machine. It's a balancing act between the oil-producing countries, a group trying to coordinate in a system that resists being controlled. And that's why it behaves the way it does. Sometimes it's unified, sometimes it gets divided, and it's always adjusting. Then the moment came where all of this moved from theory into reality. Up to this point, it had been meetings, coordination, slow shifts in contracts, governments taking more control, but the world hadn't really felt it yet. Well, that changed in the early 1970s because now you had the structure in place. the relationships formed, contracts signed, and the willingness to act together under pressure. And when that pressure hit, OPEC didn't just talk about supply, they moved it. Thus, oil production was reduced, exports were restricted, and the effect was immediate, overnight. Prices didn't just rise, they surged. And for the first time, the entire global economy reacted to a decision made by oil-producing nations. Gas lines formed, costs jumped, governments scrambled. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was visible, and people felt it in real time. That moment is what created the image most people still carry today, that OPEC controls oil. Because from the outside, it looked like a switch had been flipped. Supply went down, prices went up, and the world had to respond. It looked like control. It felt like control. And for that window of time, it was the closest OPEC ever came to truly moving the system in a unified way. But even in that moment, there were cracks underneath it. Because the same pressures that existed before didn't disappear, well, they intensified. Remember, if they all stopped producing, then that means Venezuela isn't producing as much. Venezuela's really hurting. It's only doing, what, right now, only 1 million barrels a day. But back then, in the 70s, hardly that much. Great for Saudi Arabia because they can go with the flow. Pun intended. But not good for the smaller countries. So higher prices meant more money coming in, which sounds like a win, but it also created new problems. Countries inside OPEC started seeing different opportunities. Some wanted to keep prices high and hold supply tight. Others saw a chance to produce more and take advantage of the higher price per barrel. Well, the incentive to stay aligned started to weaken as the rewards for acting independently increased. Now, at the same time, the rest of the world didn't just absorb the impact. We all reacted. Higher prices pushed oil-consuming nations to rethink everything. New exploration started outside of OPEC. This is where we started to play around with ethanol, corn oil. Alternative sources became more attractive. Efficiency became a priority. Well, the system didn't stay still. It adapted. And that adaptation started to chip away at the very control OPEC had just demonstrated in the 70s. So what looked like a moment of dominance was actually the beginning of a new phase. OPEC had proven it could influence the system. But in doing so, it triggered responses that would make that influence harder to maintain. The higher the price went, the more pressure built for the system to push back. And that's the part that most people miss. The moment in the 1970s wasn't the establishment of permanent control. It was the peak of it, the high point, the moment where everything aligned just long enough to show what was possible. But the forces underneath, internal differences, external reactions, market adjustments, well, we're already moving in the opposite direction. So in a way, you could say that with them coming together and lowering the production of oil, in the short term was great. In the long term, it hurt because ingenuity. Americans were complaining, high prices, and it forced the system to figure out alternatives. So as quickly as the world felt that surge, the conditions that created it were already beginning to shift. And I don't think that the OPEC people coming together, the leaders of all those oil-producing countries, understood what they were doing in the long run. I'm sure they were not happy with the control. And there was more politics behind all of this, but this is the simplest way I can explain it. What they were doing was trying to stop the Seven Sisters from dictating what prices of oil should be. And they said, enough. And then power quickly switched. It did a 180. And with that, the Seven Sisters knew their gig was up. And once that surge settled, the dust finally settled, well, the system started doing what systems like this always do. It pushed back. Now, high prices sound like power, but they come with consequences. When oil became expensive, countries that depended on it had no choice but to adapt. They started looking for oil outside of OPEC. Places that weren't as important before, like the North Sea, Alaska, later even smaller fields, suddenly became worth developing. Technology improved. Exploration expanded. And slowly, more supply started coming from outside the group. More supply started to come from outside of OPEC. Well, at the same time, demand didn't just keep climbing the way it had before. When energy gets expensive, people change behavior. Governments push efficiency. Industries adjust. Consumption slows down. So now you've got two things happening at once. More supply coming from outside OPEC and demand not growing as fast. Well, that balance starts to shift again. Inside OPEC, well, let me take a step back. Boots says, I remember that pushing our station wagon from gas station to the next one across the street with my dad sitting in the driver's seat because the gas station we were at ran out of gas, and so did we. We all have a little story about the 70s. Now, for me personally, I was born in 74, so I don't remember jack squat about the 70s, but I can assure you that I heard about it over and over and over in the 80s and 90s and oohs and teens and now the 20s. So inside OPEC, the pressure got worse because now prices weren't just high, they were unstable. And when prices move like that, every country feels it differently. Some needed to keep prices elevated to support their budgets. Others needed to increase production just to maintain income. So the agreements that had worked during the surge became harder to hold. And this is where the cracks really opened up. Quotas were set, quotas, limits on how much each country was supposed to produce. But when money is on the line here, sticking to limits gets harder. Some countries started producing more than they agreed to. Not publicly, not officially, but it happened. You've ever heard of the Great Oil Embargo? Embargo means shipping under the radar. And once one country does it, and gets away with it, like Russia, others follow. Because no one wants to lose out while someone else takes advantage. And this did not hurt Saudi Arabia. So now you've got a situation where the group is trying to restrict supply to keep prices up, but individual members are quietly increasing supply to protect their own interests. That tension pulls the whole structure apart. And then the breaking point hits in the 1980s. Prices don't just soften, they collapse. Oil that had been selling for high levels drops dramatically. And the reason isn't one single event. It's everything coming together. Increased production outside OPEC, slower demand, internal overproduction, loss of discipline. Well, the system resets. That collapse is one of the clearest signals you'll ever see that OPEC couldn't maintain control. Because if it truly had control, as if they thought they did in the beginning, that kind of drop just wouldn't have happened. But it did. And when it did, it exposed the limits of the entire structure. Now, what's interesting is how the group responds. OPEC, the group of oil-producing countries that all came together and decided to go against the Seven Sisters. You know, these are the one of them like Standard Oil, the other one's British Petroleum, okay? It stops acting like it can fully control prices and starts acting more like a stabilizer. It tries to manage swings instead of dictate outcomes. It becomes reactive instead of dominant. And Saudi Arabia plays a key role here again. Because when the system starts breaking down, someone has to absorb the balance and the imbalance. Saudi Arabia cuts production deeply at times to support prices. Other times, Saudi Arabia increases production to regain market share. It moves back and forth depending on what the situation calls for. Not because it's controlling everything, but because it's trying to keep the system from swinging too far in either direction. So what you end up with is something very different from the image people still carry. Not a group in control, but a group constantly adjusting. Not a fixed structure, but a flexible one. Always reacting to pressure, never fully eliminating it. And it's clear in my studies of this that the Seven Sisters and OPEC were fighting each other. Very clear. Does that look like a new world order? And once you see that, the idea of stable control starts to fade. Because what's actually happening is a balance that keeps getting tested and keeps shifting. As much as the Seven Sisters wanted to control it all, OPEC basically stood their ground, and we all paid a price for it. We licked our wounds and went searching for oil elsewhere. Now, America was producing oil, and that's a whole nother story. If it was producing oil, why did America's prices go up? Well, doesn't mean we don't have greedy masters. And this is where the focus naturally tightens in on one country. Because as the system becomes more unstable, one player kept showing up at the center of every major shift. Saudi Arabia. Not because it owned OPEC. It did not own it. It was just a member. And not because it controlled every decision, but because it had something no one else really had at the same scale. They had room to move. Meaning, in their economy, they prepared for ups and downs. They would just stop production and know that production could stop at a certain level, and they would budget and make sure that their country would last during the hard times. All the other countries didn't follow that same model because they ran their countries differently. And most countries inside OPEC are producing close to their limits. They need the revenue, like Venezuela, obviously. This is why China went in, because they needed revenue. They needed money, and China gave them a deal. Give us oil and trade, and we'll build your infrastructure so you can produce more oil. And then we stole it. So they need the revenue, so they pump what they can. But Saudi Arabia built its entire strategy differently. It knew that the Seven Sisters could attack them in some way, form, or fashion because they helped shift the entire dynamic of prices. And they knew that was coming. They were smart. They maintained extra capacity on purpose. It kept the ability to produce more or less depending on the situation. And that one difference gave it influence that went beyond any formal agreement. And in a way, they're still in that same situation now, where China can't get their oil from Iran or other places. And Saudi Arabia is selling it in the yuan. And that doesn't make the federal dollar look good. But that's another story. Does it keep cutting production to support prices, even if other countries are quietly producing more? Or does it open the taps, increase supply, and protect its own market share? And at different points, it actually did both. Sometimes it absorbed the cuts, trying to hold prices up. Other times it shifted direction and let production rise, forcing the market to reset. So Saudi Arabia started to gain a little bit more influence and a little bit more control than just OPEC because of their strategy. Now, that's not control in the way that people think about it. That's something more like stewardship under pressure. They had leverage, sure. But they also knew if they pushed too hard, we or other oil-seeking nations would just go somewhere else. And they know that others might make a deal with Saudi Arabia or with Venezuela and start ramping up their oil production just like China did. It took China a while, but they finally did it. It's responding to a system that keeps pushing back, trying to keep it from breaking too far in either direction. And over time, Saudi Arabia stopped thinking about OPEC as the only framework that mattered because the world had changed. Oil wasn't just being produced inside OPEC anymore. Countries outside the group, especially later the US, shale, started adding significant supply. So even if OPEC held together perfectly, it still wouldn't be enough to control the global balance on its own. And that's when you start seeing the shift towards broader coordination. Instead of just OPEC, you get what's now called OPEC Plus, where countries like Russia come into the conversation, not as members in the traditional sense, but as partners in managing supply. That alone tells you something important. OPEC by itself isn't enough anymore. So at the same time, Saudi Arabia is balancing more than just oil decisions. It's navigating relationships with the United States, with China, with regional powers, all while managing its own long-term economic plans. Oil is still essential, but it's no longer the only piece on the board. So every production decision is tied into much bigger sets of considerations than just the price alone. And that's why, from the outside, it can feel like Saudi Arabia is moving in unpredictable ways. One moment it's cutting production alongside OPEC, another moment it's signaling something different. But when you step back, it's not random, it's responsive. It's reading the same pressure that we've been walking through: supply, demand, competition, geopolitics, and long-term positioning. So instead of seeing Saudi Arabia as stepping away from OPEC, it makes more sense to see it as operating on a wider field. Now, OPEC is still one of the tools, but it's not the only one anymore. And when the situation calls for it, Saudi Arabia will move beyond that framework to protect its own position. And that's the reality of where things have landed. Not a single group in control, but a system where influence depends on who can adjust the fastest and absorb the most pressure. And in that environment, flexibility becomes more powerful than alignment. Now, once you understand how Saudi Arabia operates, the next step is seeing what OPEC actually looks like today, because it doesn't look anything like it did in the 70s. What you have now is not a group that controls the market. It's a group trying to keep the market from swinging too far, too fast. That's a very different role. Instead of setting prices, it's reacting to them. Instead of leading the system, it's adjusting within it. And one of the clearest signs of that shift is something we touched on earlier. OPEC isn't even operating alone anymore. It had to expand. Remember the plus? That's where OPEC Plus comes in. Countries like Russia, who were never part of the original organization, are now coordinating production decisions alongside OPEC members. Well, the Seven Sisters probably didn't like that. And that tells you everything you need to know. Russia has a history of being really sneaky, and they're really good at the black market. If OPEC had full control, it wouldn't need outside help, especially from Russia. The fact that it does means the system has grown beyond its original structure. Now think about what that means in real terms. You've got OPEC countries trying to agree on production. You've got non-OPEC countries producing large amounts of oil independently of them. You've got financial markets trading oil as an asset. You've got global demand shifting based on economic growth, especially from places like China and India. All of these forces are interacting at the same time. So when OPEC announces a production cut today, it's not a command, it's a signal. It's an attempt to influence the direction of the market, knowing that the market may or may not respond the way they expect. Now, sometimes it works. Sometimes prices do rise. Other times the effect is muted because other producers step in or demand doesn't react the way it used to. And this is why you hear about compliance so often now. Because it's not just about making a decision. It's about whether the countries involved actually follow through. Well, some do, some don't. And the closer the system gets to financial pressure, the harder it becomes to maintain discipline. Now, at the same time, oil itself has changed in how it's treated. Back then, we weren't making clothes out of oil. We weren't making as much plastics because it's no longer just a physical commodity moving from one place to another. It's traded now on markets. It's priced through future contracts, influenced by expectations about the future. That means perception can move prices just as much as actual supply. A rumor, like when Elon Musk posts an X, a policy shift, a geopolitical event, well, these things can push prices before a single barrel is even produced or withheld. So the system today, guys, it's layered. Physical supply on one side, financial markets on the other. So political decisions are layered on top. And OPEC sits inside that system, yeah, but they're trying to nudge it, not control it. And this is where the shift becomes pretty clear. What used to be a structure that tried to dictate outcomes has become one that tries to manage uncertainty. It's no longer about control, it's about influence. And even that influence is constantly being tested by everything else happening around it. And I wanted to do this show because I wanted to show you guys that Saudi Arabia has been talking about leaving OPEC. So I wanted you to understand what OPEC is, what its beginnings were, how it formed, how much it makes, why it does it the way why it does the things that it does. And what kind of what would that do if they left OPEC altogether? So when people hear about OPEC making a move and expect a direct, predictable result, then that expectation is based on an older version of the system. So today, if Saudi Arabia says we're raising prices $20 a barrel, it really won't affect dick. It won't. Because the current reality is more complex than that. It's a balancing act between all oil producers, with multiple players adjusting at the exact same time, each responding to pressure in their own way. And that's why the outcomes don't feel clean or predictable anymore. Because they're not coming from a single source. They're coming from a system that's constantly shifting underneath itself. So no, it's not being controlled by the Khazarians, the ancient Persian, Illuminati, Zionist Jews. It's not controlled by anyone. And for Saudi Arabia to even say that they are considering moving out of OPEC and just supplying it on their own to anyone who wants to buy it, that's very telling. Because they're not coming from a single source anymore. They're coming from a system that's constantly shifting underneath itself. And once you see what OPEC actually is today, the next question should be obvious. If they don't fully control oil anymore, then what does? Because something is moving prices. Something is pushing gas up and down. And the answer isn't just one thing. It's a combination of forces all pulling at the same time. Start with demand. This is the foundation. When economies grow, especially large ones, they need more energy, more transportation, more manufacturing, more movement of goods. Countries like China and India, they play a huge role here. When their economies expand, global demand for oil increases. When they slow down, demand softens. Now, that alone can move prices without a single decision from OPEC. Then you have supply outside of OPEC, and this changed everything. For a long time, OPEC controlled a large share of global production, but over time, other producers stepped in. The United States, especially with shale oil, they became a major player, and shale operates differently. It can ramp up production relatively quickly when prices are high. So when OPEC cuts supply to push prices up, U.S. producers can respond by increasing output, which pushes prices back down. That back and forth limits how much control any one group can have. Now layer in the financial markets. Oil isn't just bought and sold physically. It's traded. These are futures contracts, speculation, hedging. All of that influences price. Traders aren't just reacting to what's happening today. They're reacting to what they think will happen tomorrow. And if there's tension somewhere in the world, prices can rise on expectation alone. If there's fear of a slowdown, prices can drop before demand actually changes. So now, price is being shaped by perception as much as reality. Then you have geopolitics, conflict, sanctions, instability. These all affect supply and expectations. A disruption in one region can ripple across the entire system. Case in point, Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. Even the possibility of disruption can move markets. And it doesn't take an actual shortage. It just takes the belief that one might happen. And finally, technology. This is the quieter force, but it really matters. This is what we call logistics. Improvements in efficiency, alternate energy development, electric vehicles, all of these reduce long-term dependence on oil. They don't eliminate it, but they change how demand grows. And when demand growth changes, the entire balance shifts. Case in point, electronic cars, Elon Musk, Tesla. Did prices go down when Tesla came out with all of his cars? No. So what you end up here is a system where demand is rising and falling based on global growth. Supply is expanding beyond traditional producers. Markets are pricing in expectations. Politics is constantly adding pressure. Technology is slowly reshaping the future. And a year before a president comes in, actually can change market speculation. Is it going to be a Democrat? Is it going to be a Republican? Because they don't act the same and they don't make the same decisions. So demand is rising and falling based on global growth. And supply is expanding beyond traditional producers. And technology, it's slowly reshaping the future as politics constantly adds pressure. And markets are pricing in their expectations of what's going to happen. So all of these things are all happening at the exact same time. So when oil prices move today, it's not coming from a single decision. It's coming from the interaction of all of these forces. OPEC is still part of that equation, yes, but it's just one part. What it did in the 70s cannot happen now because we adjusted to make sure it doesn't. And when I say we, I'm not saying the elite or the people. I'm saying the world itself adjusted so that it doesn't rely on just one place. And this is kind of what's happening in America right now with Trump and his administration trying to clamp down on just Northern America being one hub with all resources using together instead of relying on others for manufacturing. So when oil prices move, it's not coming from a single decision. It's coming from the interaction of all of these forces. And that's why trying to point to one cause, it's not OPEC anymore, doesn't hold up anymore. The system is layered now. It's responsive. It's constantly adjusting. And the price that you see is the result of everything colliding at once. In a way, you could call it chaos. We just don't know. And this is where it stops being about charts, countries, and agreements. And it starts showing up in real life, that affects you, the people. Because oil isn't just something you put in your car. It's tied to everything that moves. Every truck delivering food, every ship crossing the ocean, every plane in the air, every piece of machinery running somewhere in the background, it all depends on energy. And a huge part of that energy still comes from oil. So when prices shift, it doesn't stay isolated. It spreads all across the world. And you see it first at the gas pump because that's the most visible. Prices go up and it's immediate. But that's just the surface. Behind that, transportation costs rise. It becomes more expensive to move goods from one place to another. And when it costs more to move something, that cost gets passed along. Food prices creep up. Products cost more. Services adjust. It doesn't happen all at once, but it moves through the system quietly. And what Trump did in Iran, choking Hormuz, it affected us. The prices went up. And now we know what happens when you look at the gas prices. And if they go up $1, expect within the next few months, unless the prices go back down, expect within a few months, your candy bar is going to be another 10 cents. Because the more gas it takes to get production from A to B, from A to Z, they have to raise prices. And that doesn't happen all at once, but it does move through the system quietly to where one day you're buying eggs and they're freaking $12 for 12. Or what are they now? $25 for 12? Like $2 an egg. So it's not just movement, it's production. Oil is part of manufacturing. Plastics, packaging, fertilizers. So when energy costs rise, it affects how things are made, not just how they're delivered. And that's why you can walk into a store and see higher prices, even if you haven't thought about oil at all. It's built into the system in ways that most people never see directly. Now take that and add uncertainty. Because when prices are stable, businesses can plan. They can set prices, they can manage costs, they can make decisions with some level of confidence. But when oil prices move unpredictably, that stability disappears. Companies have to adjust faster. They build in buffers. They raise prices sooner to protect themselves. And that creates a feeling that everything is always going up. even when the initial shift might have been very, very small. And on a larger scale, it affects jobs, investment, and growth. Industries tied to energy respond quickly. If prices drop, production slows in some areas. If prices rise, costs increase in others. So the system keeps adjusting, and those adjustments ripple outward. This is why people feel it, even if they're not watching oil markets, because it shows up in daily decisions. How far you drive, how much things cost, how businesses operate. It's not abstract, it's built into the rhythm of everyday life. And when you connect that back to everything we've been walking through, it starts to make sense. I hope you have a pretty good understanding now. Because if you look at this, it would be really, really difficult for just one group of people, a new world order, to control the prices of oil at this time, because of all the layers that are added to it and the infrastructures. And when things change in just one part of the world, it may or may not affect oil. If no single group fully controls oil anymore, and prices are being shaped by multiple forces at once, then the effects are going to feel uneven. And you're going to want to blame, point fingers. This is all Biden's fault. This is all Trump's fault. This is all Obama's fault. If those leftists weren't in office ever, if we just took them out, then we would have never had this. It has nothing to do with that. Even though they get probably paid under the table for passing laws that favor one side or the other, it doesn't matter. Because the logic is, the truth is, not one entity can affect the price of oil. And sometimes prices rise quickly. Sometimes they fall. Sometimes they don't move the way that people expect. And what people are feeling isn't random. It's the result of a system that's constantly adjusting underneath them. And because oil sits at the center of so much movement and production, these adjustments don't stay contained. They reach into everything. And this is why it feels the way it does right now. Because when people look at gas prices or the cost of living, they expect there to be a clean, simple reason. It's the Jews. They want something simple. A decision, a policy, a group pulling a lever somewhere. It's not true. But what you're actually dealing with is a system that doesn't move in straight lines anymore. It used to. It did back in 1970. It did before 1970. It reacts. So prices go up and the system responds. More production comes online. Demand adjusts. Investments shifts. Then prices go down and the system reacts again. Production slows. Supply tightens. Demand picks back up. It's constantly correcting itself, but those corrections don't happen smoothly. They overshoot. They lag. They collide with other pressures happening all at the same time. And that's where the unpredictability comes from. You've got global demand changing based on economic growth. You've got supply shifting as producers respond to price. You've got markets reacting to expectations, not just reality. You've got geopolitical tensions layered on top of all of it. And then you've got policy decisions, sometimes helping, sometimes complicating things even further. None of these move independently. They all interact. So instead of a stable system where prices settle into a predictable range, you get movement. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always adjusting. And when multiple pressures hit at once, like conflict, supply changes, and market reactions, you get sharper swings. That's why it can feel like things don't make sense. Because one week prices rise even though there's no obvious shortage. Another week they fall even though demand hasn't dropped dramatically. It's not because something's hidden, folks. It's because multiple forces are hitting the system all at the same time. And the outcome is the result of all of that. Not just one person, one entity, the Jews. All of that blaming some aristocratic group of Zionists, that they're the ones that are shifting and changing the world. If you can just see it through oil and the history of it, you can see that it's not one group changing things. They did in the past when they can when it's new. But when it finally settles and the world is in with it, they can't control it anymore. And this is something that you guys need to understand about the future. When the infrastructure of AI and the technology that's going to be built in the beginning, they're going to be able to control it, whoever they are. Could be the tech giants, the technocrats we talked about last night. But let's be honest with each other. We could take a look at oil and how popular that was and how it shifted from power to uncertainty to chaos. We're going to see that same thing happen with technology, where a computer may one day be $3,000, and then the next week it'll be $800. It's still brand new. It's still under the control of the techno giants. Well, when a group of people come together, just like OPEC did in the 70s, and then decide, hey, I can't sell computers at $700. It costs me $700 to make it. I've got to sell the computers at $3,000. I have to make a profit and then some. That's the truth. And it's not likely going to go away. We're going to see this in the future. Philip says, but I do see a lot of Jewish expansion. Sure. And I'm seeing a lot of Islam expansion. And Islam doesn't work with the Jews. They're not buddies. I see a lot of Christianity expansion. You see, there's some propaganda thing going on to make you want to hate the Jews. And that's absolutely ridiculous. And probably because there is a group of people that want to start World War III or want to bring in their Messiah in Israel to take over the world, and they're just not getting it. It's not happening. Everyone's freaking out, thinking that the Antichrist is here at the door. And if you look at the world from a common sense point of view, when you really dig in and do some research and look at the history of all things, just like I've done, I get disappointed because the answer isn't as simple as blaming it on a group of people that got together underground. We've got to get out of that bigotness because it's so easy to fall into it because that's the simplest explanation. Great. Now we know the Jews control the world. Now we know the Messiah is coming because the whole world's going to hate Israel in the end because the Bible says so, and they're going to be a thorn in the side, and they're all going to come after them. Let's get past all of that. That's stuff that God's working on. Your job is to just love your neighbor. So the truth is it's not likely going to go away. Okay? Oil prices are going to go up and down, up and down, up and down, because the system has grown too large and too interconnected to be controlled by any single group. The data, that's what the data says. And I'm a logistics person. And it's shaped by countries, companies, markets, and technology all at once. And each one is responding to its own pressures. So what you're feeling isn't chaos, it's complexity. It's a system that's constantly adjusting, constantly reacting, and constantly trying to find balance without ever fully settling. And once you see that, I see it. Once you see that, the frustration starts to shift, because instead of looking for a single cause that explains everything, you start recognizing the pattern. There's movement, response, and then adjustment. And it just happens over and over and over again. So to conclude, when you step back and look at all of this together, the picture gets a lot clearer. OPEC wasn't created to control the world. It was created because oil-producing countries were being controlled. They didn't like that, so they stopped it. That doesn't sound like a new world order to me. And for a brief moment, it worked. Then they coordinated, they reduced supply, and then they showed the world that they could influence the system. But that influence didn't turn into permanent control. The system adapted. Other producers stepped in. Markets evolved, and the balance shifted again. What you have today isn't a single group running oil. It's a system made up of competing forces, countries trying to protect their economies, companies trying to stay profitable, markets reacting to expectations, and global demand constantly changing. That doesn't sound like a new world order where everyone's under the same agreement, same church, same army. I really honestly used to think that the Breakspears and Orsini's was Breakspears and Orsini's. Now I'm starting to see they tried to control. But the logic is, in the beginning, the new technology, AI and all that shit, that's going to be under control until people go, we're going to go find something else. That's how the world works, folks. Satan is not going to get his new world order. In the 7-day tribulation, he may, but hey, that may have already happened if you're a preterist. Now, OPEC is still part of that system, and it does still have some influence, but it's no longer the center of control as it was when they came together in the 70s, decided to stop big production. And that matters because it explains why things feel the way that they do. Prices move quickly, costs rise in ways that don't always seem connected. There isn't a clean, simple reason behind every shift, because there isn't a single source behind it. And what you're feeling is the result of a system that's constantly adjusting under pressure. Don't get mad at me because I debunk things. But once you understand that, something changes. You stop chasing headlines that try to pin everything on one decision or one group. That's politics. Get out of it. You start seeing the pattern instead, how supply, demand, and reaction keep moving the system forward. And that clarity takes some of the weight off of it. Hopefully, I hope you guys have a good understanding now, and we can quit being bigoted, pointing all of our fingers at King Charles or the Jews. Because what looks like chaos is actually a system doing exactly what it is built to do. It's built to respond.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.